Thank you very much, Caesar, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. We take great pride in our center, the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest, to be hosting these events this week with Homi Bhabha. It's been such a pleasure to have him and for the conversations that have taken place on Tuesday, yesterday, also rich, also deep, and really engaging. And so it's such a blessing for us to have now William Kentridge joining Homi today to speak about their work, a conversation that they've had together over a long period. They've had other dialogues together, public dialogues in the US. They're bringing this dialogue here. And Homi, of course, is a master of curating these conversations. And William, as you witnessed, I think last year, December, our event last year, he is such an artist in presenting and sharing his work. They both are such generous scholars, a scholar and an artist, and so generous, both of them. Their work, socially engaged, wonderful work that you are interested in, you are engaging with in our center. And they both brought their families to be with us. And so we're very welcoming you both. Anne, whom I don't see, there is Anne, yeah. And welcome to you and Jacqueline and your sons here. So really a hearty welcome to all of you for supporting your partners and for bringing them to us. So we're very pleased about that. Thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon and sharing this very special event. Homi is a very special person for us at Stellenbosch University, but especially at our center. He was honored with an honorary doctorate a few years ago in 2019. As an honorary doctorate that was awarded by the Vice Chancellor at the time in 2019. And more recently, he has become an extraordinary professor affiliated with our center. Our center is a long name that I gave you, but you can call it AVReQ for short. How blessed, how lucky we are to have him as an extraordinary professor linked to us. We are hoping that we will lure you, William, as well, into some kind of an affiliation so that we make this an annual event for your coming here. So we're really, really very, very pleased that you are here. The work of the arts is something that we at the center are interested in, are working with. We have museum curators as postdocs. We've got artists as graduate students. We collaborate with the visual arts department. Why is the art so important? And I think some of these conversations are bringing us back to that question of why is the art so important for us in our work, but also in the humanities itself. We have the dean here, our dean, Professor Anthony Leysons, who's also coming to show us that this conversation is very important. So thank you so very much. We are grateful to STEERS because we know these are part of the conversation that STEERS has as well. Edward, I see, is here. So thank you very much for making it a special afternoon for us and coming to join us. Now, these two people are two men who literally need no introduction. So I am going to leave it at that and leave it their conversation. They are going to be sharing with us. I see, oh, Wendy is in the audience and Hilton. Wendy Applebaum and Hilton, I didn't notice you. Thank you very much. We are so lucky today. This is going to be a wonderful conversation. That just to have all of you here to listen to this great conversation between the two of you. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for all of you for being here today. Thank you to Prof. Pumla, who has been a real guiding spirit in my life and in my work. So thank you. Also to Prof. Edward for having us here at STEERS, to Prof. William for always being open to conversation, to discussion, to challenges, putting me on my mettle. It's a wonderful dialectic. Also, I want to thank our friends who have been looking after us, Wendy and Hilton Applebaum. You know, they say that there is a conflict between nature and nurture. There's this a long sociological debate as to what makes the person who he or she is. When you stay and are looked after by Wendy and Hilton, they somehow blend nature and nurture. There ain't any sociological problem at all, nor even a cult. Too much nurture and great nature. So thank you both very much. William, as always, splendid to be in your company. So I'm going to, you know, the thing about you is you deal with really difficult ideas which attract me, because I try to deal with similar sorts of difficult ideas. You do them so well that everybody falls in love with you. I do them so, I struggle to do them and I can never get them across. So I think what we should first do is actually show that, framing, and maybe you can frame it for the audience and say what it is.
Okay, I mean, thank you, Homi. It's such a pleasure again to be back in conversation, talking about this. We have regular phone conversations trying to parse out different ideas. Or rather, I think it's important maybe, and we can come back to stress that the activities in the studio are really stupid. That there's a kind of rigor of thinking in Homi's writing about topics that is very far from the way that the studio works, where you start with a gesture or an image and you hope it's going to connect or illuminate something somewhere down the track, but you give unclear thoughts a benefit of the doubt and see where they come. And so often when Homi has a very clear understanding of a point which may or may not be in the work, which might be in the work, for me it's always a new way of thinking about it.
Thank you.
So that's one of the pleasures of the conversations, is that there are new thoughts that come out from the work. But the work that I've been doing for the last year and a half, which reaches completion in July, is a theater project. It's a kind of chamber opera about a ship's journey from Marseille to Martinique in 1941, of refugees escaping Vichy France. And on the historic boat, there were people like Victor Serge, a communist writer. There was André Breton, the surrealist. There was Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist. But on our ship in the theater production, I'm more interested in what came from Martinique to Paris and went back. And there was, Martinique, as you know, is a tiny place. It's like the size from Johannesburg to Pretoria. It's a tiny, tiny island. But after the war between Britain and France, France agreed to give Britain the entirety of Canada if they could keep Martinique. There was so much money being made from the sugar plantations there. And from it, remarkable poets and writers have emerged. So on this boat between Europe and Martinique, thinking about that journey, we also placed the great poet Aimé Césaire, whose poem Notebook for a Return to My Native Land is still a kind of foundational text in many ways, in people thinking about the end of colonialism. And also Suzanne Césaire, lesser known, less prominent writer, but in many ways the founder, together with the Nadal sister, of the whole negritude movement in Paris in the 1930s. And of course we also bring on, just momentarily, not central in it, but the person who did that journey from Martinique to Paris, but after the war. And that, of course, was the school, the person who'd been taught by both Aimé Césaire and Suzanne, and that's Frantz Fanon. So there's a kind of the poetic prehistory to Fanon that is in Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, and obviously things shift a lot. But what we'll start by doing is just showing the first chorus. The theater production, or the opera, the chamber opera, has a chorus of women singers, so there should be 7 women singing here, but we'll just hear their voices.
Yabulum Wena endingamncedanga ndinike indlebe zama ukuvisisa le ntetho elula. Wena engingamusizanga ndinike indlebe zama ukuzwisisa le nkulumo elula. Zulu lezizwe hela vikela mina angikakhuselwa tingwaba tebe kuhamba izifika namthwalo azikaze zangisiza angikakhuselwa tingwaba tebe kuhamba dibusa lomondlalo dibusa nesihlalo kungoba kutheni na ingani le nkathi le inobunxokololo idlula ezinye kungani le nkari le ibile idlula tingwane kungani le nkathi le inobunxokololo idlula ezinye kungani le nkari le ibile idlula tingwane. Wena engingamusizanga nginike indlebe zama ukuzwisisa le nkulumo elula. Iphalase lemntu wonke iphalase lemntu wonke iphalase lemntu wonke jikelele jikelele anile nkarile ibile kundlula tingwane ingani le nkathi le inobunxokololo idlula ezinye kungani le nkari le ibile kundlula tingwane kungani le nkathi le inobunxokololo idlula ezinye ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo ilishwa liphokoza okomfula usuthu kangwane lithi phokopoko likophoze lithi kopokopo esileni inoma umxokololo indlula ezinye nyakada klitiala shulesika ubuhloba buyindlu yakithi ngiloza nguphalo zowuqithiswa zibelula nezakho yimba ngeculo lezo zinhlungu ngoba ubuhle buyovelela ekugcineni
What a work of genius. When I was watching that, I didn't know whether the appropriate. Sorry, Caesar. When I was watching that, I didn't know whether it would be more appropriate to keep silence after that or to clap. But the audience spontaneously clapped, and I think that's what we will go with. Now, you know, I've been working on this only for the last 2 or 3 days since I got it, and it's just so rich and full. But I'm going to actually start, William, with what sounds like an easy question, but in your usual way, I want you to make it difficult. So my question is this, that you manage at scale to take up some of the largest issues, head in the load, the whole First World War and its use of Indian and African labor. Now this new work, The Great Yes and the Great No, is about the island of Martinique as both a refuge and as a remarkable cornucopia of ideas that stay with us now, particularly in the mode of surrealism and activism, and we'll come to that. Now, so there's the big idea. Then there is the great screen across which your work works globally. I've seen it in Paris, I've seen it in Rome, I've seen it. It's there you have that big screen. You make that transition. Now, then there is the making of the work here in South Africa. And I want to ask you how you manage a kind of easeful transition of scale. And I want you to talk about, just briefly, about what it means to make these works, great international events, looking for the voices that have often been forgotten or overlooked, translating often between several languages, German, French, and then various African languages, using Africans to speak about those, to sing about that, not only and to perform. How do you make these, I've called it easeful but very attentive translations?
The immediate question would be through the people that are in the room while it is being made. And it's made in Johannesburg, so it's primarily Johannesburg singers and performers. A piece like this, for example, this is trawled, the text arrives, so this introductory chorus setting a kind of a broad parameter for the piece, from a notebook in which I keep phrases that strike me from different things that I'm read. So just, I mean, to the first line, now the House of Justice has collapsed, there's been wrong done, I ask for right, is from the Oresteia, that's Aeschylus. Then there's a line from Stanislaw Milosz, the poet, then from Anna Akhmatova. So there are a range of different writers. As the piece progresses, there's more and more from Césaire and Suzanne Césaire and Fanon and Bertolt Brecht. But it's a combination. So I'm not a writer, I'm a collator of, and make a collage or a montage, a bricoleur of different found texts. Then just in terms of the actual process, because the actual process does answer the question to some extent, I would come with a series of lines like this to the room and say, here is a possible text. And Nhlanhla Mahlangu, who is the composer or in charge of the choral composition with the women, takes the text and gives them to the singers. Each singer translates the text into, in this case, her mother tongue. So there are a range of different, from Venda to Zulu to Xhosa to Siswati, different singers with different mother tongues. And then he works with them saying, well, how would you sing that line? Let's see. And then says, okay, this line is very beautiful. The Zulu version of this line is great. So we're going to go from this line into that. And with the women who are also the composers, not simply the performers of someone else's composition, it gets put together. And then with the video editors, I'll say, well, I want to have we have a lot of repetitions. And if you have a lot of repetitions for things to state themselves, how do you deal that with a text? If you have surtitles, do you just repeat the surtitle and then it comes back on? Or in opera, usually you see it once and that's all. They don't keep repeating it. But we discovered this way of having this wheel that's kind of turning as a way of coming back and having the repetition within it. So to arrive at this, there are many different people in the room that does it. And because it's made in Johannesburg with the singers that are there in the players, that is very much infected and inflected by being made. So whatever the ostensible subject, it's always from here outwards. And even though it's Martinique and it's 1941, so much of your writing is the way in which writers from that period in Fanon it's not just of historical interest what they're writing, but the questions that are so present now. So that's... Sorry, long answer.
No, that's a great answer. And I think it refers back to what we've all seen this morning, and I think that's an important way of getting into the questions for today. The way you set it out here, I've been looking at this bit of the video for the last couple of days and thinking that the intricacy of design is very important. Here, you have these questions. Why have I been deserted? Why is the House of Justice collapsed? Is this the worst age that there ever was? Where else was it as bad as this? But you have them, these questions splayed against these revolving discs, if I might put it. Partly, it has this wonderful effect because it's partly like the instruments that navigators on ships use to navigate. So that struck me initially. Sextants, or whatever you call them. But it's also about the roulette game of the world itself. The roulette game, and who, yes.
In terms of the roulette game, the way the different circles arrived is from one of the familiar images of surrealism, which is like roulette, of chance playing its part in how. And one of the games, one of the surrealist games, is that game which in English is translated incorrectly as the exquisite corpse, the exquisite body. Children's game, a party game. Someone draws a head, and you fold the sheet of paper over, just showing the neck, and somebody draws the torso, and folds it over, and you just see the waist, and somebody else draws the legs, and then you open it all out and see that combination.
The surrealist figure.
And so that's what the turning discs also, which we use more further on than in this particular piece, where you have one character's head, the head of Césaire, and then it becomes maybe the body of Josephine Bonaparte, and then the legs of someone else, to play with that. And the surrealists were trying to say one of their strategies or techniques to try to disrupt a viewpoint was to use chance, to draw words out of a hat, to write questions and cover the questions over and write an answer without knowing what the question is, to look for chance connections between them, to rely on the provocation of us having to make connections, which we do all the time, even when they're not the intended connections.
So let me just say that I think you've taken this surrealist idea of the paroxysm, which is in the Surrealist Manifesto, I think, and you've taken the game, the ludic aspect, the playing of the game, of chance. But in my view, you have emphasized risk. And there is in these historical moments, embedded not only in the events themselves, but in the temporality, in the flow of time that constitutes us ontologically as beings, not only as historical personages. You have emphasized, like actually James Baldwin talks about risk, Fanon talks about risks. I think risk is something that you have turned from the surrealist chance games into a deadly serious game. And I want to now say something about how I saw this opening that our friends here have seen once I thought about it as risk and a major existential risk. So these questions, in some ways, William, are really unanswerable. And as you've said, is this the worst epoch ever? Or can there be another epoch as bad as this? Everybody in their own lives ask that question. There really isn't an answer to it. The Palace of Justice has collapsed. You quote that from Aeschylus. And so there's a whole historical, it's not a historical comparison. It's this churning around the wheels of these questions. But these are very important questions. These are questions that are usually classified as questions of universalism, things that we've really got to know. Now, what you've done so brilliantly, I think, is that you have, like Bertolt Brecht, emphasized in a way the urgent banality of these questions. Is this the worst time? No answer to that, etc. But I think what you're doing here, and this is what you're taking universal issues, universal questions, and in my interpretation, what you're saying is the universals are never fundamental principles alone. The universals are often, things become universal because we ask these questions again and again at different times. So it is the interrogative nature of the universal, the repetitious nature of the universal, as you've shown us, that really says, whatever Aeschylus said. His comparison was different. How do I now answer this question? So the universal is not a fundamental assumption, it's an interrogation and a repetition.
Yeah, I mean, I'd pose it slightly differently to that. It's not saying, you're right, I'm not interested in saying, oh, well, these are universal questions that continue and roll around non-stop. But I'm astonished that lines from particular times feel so apt to the local, to the immediate. So lines that Bertolt Brecht's writing in the 1930s, wherever you are going, of course, where you are going, there it will be worse. And wherever you're coming from, there it was better. Wherever you're coming from, there you will not be missed. Wherever you're going to, there you will not be welcomed. And you have such a sense of this as a condition of migrancy today, of people being so unwelcomed and so unmissed in both places and being stuck in that limbo between.
Yeah.
So, yes, and it may be in different pockets of the world that is a question that's rolled around, but it's because it lands so particularly rather than universally that it's a question.
Exactly. So that's why I'm saying the universal is not, as most people think, it is a fundamental principle or value. It is a question which we have to answer in this way. I mean, when you talk about that Brecht line, I think about the Hannah Arendt line from 1941, where she says, our enemies put us in concentration camps, and our friends put us in detention camps. So, but I think the interesting thing is that these lines reverberate in their own times and spaces. Yeah. Your work immediately brings them up against, crashes them with the risk of the present. And if there is something that actually resonates through the work, it is why we have the risk to have to think universally, even when we know it is a historical problem. So let me ask you then, based on that, why surrealism in all your works? Look at the titles themselves, The Head and the Load, The Great Yes and the Great No. One of the things about surrealism, you add things, but you don't add them up. Adding is different to adding up. And I think this is something that I felt quite strongly in looking at this work.
So I'm interested in, I've never thought of that distinction between adding and adding up. I mean, the way of working, again, just to bring it back into the studio and how it is working with fragments. So there's this fragment, which is the first chorus. There's a scene with some texts of Fanon, which in fact are sung by one of the women singers, Fanon's words. There's the Breton brothers we've made the Bretons, because we work with cardboard masks that have the image of the characters. We found we had, in fact, two masks, two photographs of André Breton. We'd made two instead of one. So we now have the Breton twins. So the Breton twins become like, I don't know if you remember in the Tintin books, there was Thompson and Thompson, the two incompetent detectives. So we now have the Breton twins, who are kind of like slightly incompetent, quite crazy, arguing with each other over the surrealist manifesto. And so that's a fragment. So we add fragments, as we did with The Head and the Load and with other projects, but in the hope that in the end, cumulatively, they don't remain simply fragments, but that their connections start to suggest themselves to us making it, and hopefully in the end to an audience watching it. So that relationship between fragmentation, or working with fragments, or collaging or montaging fragments, and saying this very fragmentation and putting of things together is a way of making sparks of either new thinking or understanding come forward, is how we hope to work.
And one of the interesting things about bringing fragments together is the metaphor in Walter Benjamin that a translation is not like reproducing the original, but by restructuring the original as if you had all the fragments of the past, or you had all the fragments together. So it seems to me, the work is so relevant now, not simply because those questions are provocative, those questions, but because we are always in the moment of both transition and translation as we make sense of the world around us today. And of course, we use this phrase, the world is in fragments, the world is against itself. So I wanted to ask you, what started this practice of working with a fragment rather than, say, working with a sketch over which you layered another sketch or another sketch? In both cases, there would be an interesting need to penetrate, not just to see the meaning on the face of it. But what attracted you to the fragment as an initial unit of work?
I think I would say I was not attracted to it.
Yeah.
I was reduced to it.
Okay.
That I tried very hard at different stages to write a film script, the way you would, scene one through to the end. And I discovered I was a useless storyteller. I was unable to do it. It really did not work, writing it in a linear way. The only way to arrive, the animated films that I make always, if I said, well, first I have to write a storyboard or a script, then I just sit there blankly. There's just a nullity. But if I say, well, here's an image I want, I'm not sure where it fits in the film or necessarily even what it would mean. This I'm confident of. Let me start with that. And from that, another idea is suggested or another thing is suggested. So that was the only way of working with different elements. So the kind of fragmentation was there. And then when we did the Head and the Load, the theatre piece about the First World War, I was very uncertain. I said, we need a lecture. We need someone who's going to explain the whole story because it's too fragmentary. And then the other participants in the project were the ones that said, no, for God's sake, we've done all this work. Have confidence in what you've actually made. Don't feel you then have to do the lecture. So I'm very anxious about the fact that it is fragmentary, but it is the way that the work has developed, and it either has just kind of in a way sink or swim with it.
Yeah, but and therefore I just say that anxiety has allowed you to take risk and make it into a major performative structure. The themes you choose, the great yes and the great no, are taken, as you said, from the encyclopedia of human history and human life, and yet they have a very resonant presence in our time. And you do this without trying to make things contemporary. There's no pastiche of the present in your work. What is it that you think in the moment of making that work? I want to put it very specifically. What is it about the connection between the refugee or migrant condition and then there are the double migration here, some people going back home and some people coming from home to the metropolis. How do you think, in your mind, that reflects not only on the experience of migration and refugees today, but on the whole cultural scene that gets built up around migration and refugees? That's, after all, what you've shown most strongly about the whole cultural world, the cultural reimagining of this from Aeschylus to yesterday. I'm very interested in that.
There's so many different ways of thinking it. When one thinks of all the questions of the artifacts of different parts of the world, artifacts as refugees or as migrants, unwilling migrants. When something's taken from South America and is put into a museum in Paris, it's a kind of an unwilling refugee. It's not, his opinion wasn't asked, it's put there, it's there. And on the one hand, in Europe, they hang on to that desperately, as opposed to when a human comes, there's a great reluctance to welcome it the same way the sculpture has been welcomed. Those ironies of what that journey across the Atlantic is. One of the things we can do, because it's a theatre production and it doesn't have to, it's allowed, within it we can play, we can bring anyone we like on. We have a duet between Josephine Bonaparte, the wife of Napoleon, who came from Martinique. And when Napoleon came to power, he abolished slavery throughout the French Empire, except for Martinique. The economy of it was too dependent, so it was not done. So we have Josephine Bonaparte as a kind of a memory of that transatlantic journey. But we also have Josephine Baker. And because there's an important connection, not that we play it except in her presence, as a marker for it, between people from the Harlem Renaissance coming to Paris and being very influential with people like the Nadal sisters and the Césaires, as a different way. Here are people who are not stuck to being French. In the whole question of Césaire and later on Fanon, what was it to be a black Frenchman, where you could never quite be the Frenchman or would never be accepted by the French as it, but that was also how you had constituted yourself through your education, through your desires, through many things like that. So it doesn't really answer that question directly, but those so to have contemporary migration across between Africa and Europe, the ones from the 1940s of people migrating, where it's not only Africans that are fleeing and trying to find somewhere else, and the historic transatlantic journey are there.
And just what you just said answers, or at least goes towards answering a question that I've put to you on the phone, and one that I hope we can develop, in the book, which is, why did French anti-colonialists choose the language of surrealism to articulate an imagination of freedom, whereas Anglo-centric anti-colonialists, of which I think a lot of the Indian anti-colonialists were brought up in a much more Anglo-centric tradition, would never have thought of thinking about progress of the future surrealistically. Nehru thought about it very much in terms generated by 1930s socialists, Fabian socialists, etc. A much more continuous linear notion of what progress would be compared to the surrealist notion of what a future would be. And I think that has a very important past and a very important present. The past is French colonialism was shitty, but the idea of French colonialism was you are part of our département, whether it's in Martinique or in East Africa or Western. You come to us naked, leave your culture aside, stand under the French flag of the French Republic, you become a citizen. But don't bring your cultural baggage with you. And for British colonialism, it was, try and somehow stand between your culture and our culture. Because if you're a bit anglicized, we know how to understand you, but to be anglicized is never to be British. The more you imitate us, the less you will be like us, but we will be able to somehow negotiate and talk. And I think there are two very, very different visions here.
I mean, there are. I mean, when Breton went and André Masson, the two French surrealists, went to the Caribbean, to Martinique, for them it kind of, my God, this is surrealism all the time in terms of the writing of Aimé Césaire, the kind of metaphors and imagery, the mixture of Europe and the lushness of the foliage from Martinique. That became a different way. For me, it was the shift in terms of the projects I've done between a kind of Soviet constructivist way of imagery and thinking about the world, and the latitude that surrealism had, saying we need to find a different vantage point. And so the surrealism, and it's interesting to think of surrealism and as kind of anti-fascist elements. There was a famous manifesto for a revolutionary art, which was written by Diego Rivera and André Breton at that time, but which in fact had been written largely by Trotsky. But he said, let's keep my name off it if we want people to read it. But when you read it, it's pure, there's a lot of Trotsky in that. But there was a sense of saying, I suppose it's the irony of it, surrealism was a very French undertaking, growing in France, but it became a very strong anti-colonial representation as well.
Yeah, and one of the issues was that at some point the surrealists said, now after May 68, which I thought was a rather surrealist moment, but it was a surprise to read that they said, after 68, surrealism is dead in a way. We've got, this is not the kind of, it's not the kind of revolutionary celebration of difference, of shock, of risk that we thought it was. But from this comes another larger question, I think, which is what, Fanon once said, you can never understand what it is to have a nation, to be a post-colonial nationalist, please, not in the sense of these crazy ethno-nationalist autarchs that we have now, not these authoritarian so-called nationalists who beat up minorities of many colors and many creeds. This is not. Fanon wanted a regional kind of nationalism that was which was disseminated in a way through Africa, and there was a joint thing, a joint sense of the nation. But he said you can't have a sense of the nation if you don't have a sense of internationalism, and this work is, I think, poised just there. That what you have on your boat of ship of fools, as you call it, or ship of prophets, or ship of poets and painters, are people who borrowed and translated vocabularies from many cultures, many places, and many peoples. Now, I think for our time, and for the moment of migrants and refugees now, despite the political injustices, there is a lesson to be learned about a certain kind of hybridized or vernacular cosmopolitanism, which I think this work brings out very clear. I've written about this, and so obviously I have a kindred spirit. This is not simply multiculturalism. You know, the idea very often of multiculturalism, that there are a lot of cultures who can live side by side with one another, so long as we have enough resources and space. But we're never going to have resources and space enough. So this is a kind of much more translational, intersected sense of a cosmopolitan cosmopolitan global movement. And that interests me very much, because I think this work really brings that possibility to life.
Yes, I mean, I think just as a perspective on that, the first 35 years of my life was under apartheid, and the last 33 years after that. But I think I was, and many people I think, were so formed by the sense of apartheid was about this crazy politics of identity. White people have to be together, black people, Zulus must be separated from Xhosas, all of that. And the experience of living was a mixture of so many different places and people and different thoughts, and the demand that, no, classical music shouldn't only be for white people, jazz shouldn't only be for black people. So there was a political imperative in that era and in that struggle, which for me still remains in the sense of saying, yes, one can work in South Africa with South African singers, and if the text happens to be a Greek tragedy, or if it's set in some other situation, that is part of the mixture that one has to celebrate rather than, and as you say, it's not saying, yes, let this culture live next to that culture. It's saying that sense of purity is both A, false, and B, damaging, and C, not a thing to try to aim towards. So it's a...
It's both mix it up, but not with a sense of direction, which is, I think, what the work does. I think one of the problems, I think, today, and I suppose I'm speaking, I'm here in South Africa, but I'm speaking with my head and my mouth a little bit from the US and other places, maybe here too, is that unfortunately, the globe, not globe, I don't like that word, the international, because we still have an international system, we don't really have a global system in many effective ways, that form of trying to find new linkages, new connections, new solidarities, that newness has been, at the moment, denied by the politics of identity, both at the level of leadership, where people want to control you by placing you in certain groups. Sometimes they want to encourage that group fundamentally and say, this is your right to belong to this group, to this race, and to continue. That's a politics of identity of that kind, from the top. But also, because it has become so harsh from the top, from the bottom, there is a kind of virus also happening, which is, we've got to protect ourselves. It comes from different motives. But to protect yourself around the identity in that way really feeds into the larger problem. Now, can I just clarify something? In 10 minutes, does the whole event end?
No, the opening.
Yes, shall we open it now or in 10 minutes? Okay. So I wanted to ask you, could you find that Josephine Baker thing? Is it possible to find that?
I'm trying to think. It's a fragment in one piece. I don't think without a big mess for all of us.
Okay, then don't make a mess. Sorry to, but I just thought that was so provocative and.
No, don't.
But don't.
Okay, let me. No, sorry.
play the Fanon part, which is the one we planned, the short 3-minute Fanon. Yeah, here we go.
So just to explain what you're seeing. What you're seeing is a fragment of a kind of a workshop testing out. At a certain point you said, what happens if we bring Fanon onto the boat, even though historically he's obviously after the event. And we play with some of his text, and you'll see the cardboard masks we're working with. So this is kind of an experimental fragment of it.
Any other characters you want to...
Well, you'll recognize the others. I think he's the only one with the mask, and then you'll recognize the other person standing up. The other characters you'll see is Lennon. Yeah. Not that Lennon's really on the boat, but he comes in this moment, in kind of the crossing of the bar, of the crossing of the line, crazy celebration. I think it's is it in The Wretched of the Earth or Black Faces, White Masks, where Fanon writes a lot about what is still to be learned from Lennon and what should be abandoned.
Yeah, in Wretched.
In Wretched. So that's a kind of a fragment that refers to it, not that Lennon talks, but we see it. And this is our first experiment with it.
Ukuzijule kuziviseni mnandi ngethemba lokuzayo ukunkcenkceza kwelizwe kukhanywa kuphoswe ndlebe wasiphula incambu zajikwa zajongiswa kum ndakakazwa ngazo bo ndakakazwa ngazo bo ubuntsundu bamayilolike bubuthuli nje obujulwe kwingxolo yasemini ubuntsundu bamayiloqabaza ayiloqabaza namanzi onqabela umdaka kwilizwe limpamekileyo kwaye ubuntsundu bam abuyonkoyikoyi okanye into ekunomiswa ngayo buqhophoza ngapha kwelanga liqatha ugoyigoyi buqhophoza ngapha kwesibhakabhaka sinuka ukutsha uthetha ukuba ayikho injongo yami emhlabeni ngaphandle kokuphindezela emadodeni ngo-19 donsa amehlo dlandlolo andilobanjwa le mbalini andilobanjwa le mbalini andilobanjwa le mbalini inkululeko yami ndenziwe kwalapha kum kudlebe ezikhanyilanga ndimbeke emehlweni ndimkrwaqule kakubi ndimxelele eziqhitsini ndiqhela ndiyindawo ndiqhela ndiyindawo ndiqhela ndiyindawo ndiqhela ndiyindawo.
A sense of the making or testing and seeing how things can work.
But also it's the genius, in a way, of it is the background, which is like one of those amniotic slides that you get of childbirth, because it's here, we're being born, what is the sense of becoming? It's almost like seeing the fetus of a kind of emergent history, which is exactly what Fanon here is saying. I wait, I'm belated, I'm pushed out, But how shall I return? How shall I rebuild myself? And I think, William, that is both the moment of risk and the moment of the greatest beauty in your work, where you take this moment just before birth or just before death or just before historical circumstance, and you have an imagination that develops what is so difficult to say about liminal spaces or intersectional spaces or interstitial spaces. You really give us a vocabulary for that. You know, I want to thank you, of course, for my own conversations with you, formal and informal. But I also want to thank you for reminding us about something that is a little bit of a motto of the book I'm writing. I talked about it yesterday, but at pain of repetition, I'll repeat it, because it, I think, in many ways may have come from thinking about your work. That you remind us that the past never dies and the future doesn't wait to be born. And in between those two things is both the impulse of a present moment which we are always trying to figure out, the obscurity and enigma of our times. Fanon says everybody has to fulfill a mission, but you're half blind. You don't know where to go, but you still got to fulfill a mission. That's what you allow us to do, to think about this palpating present moment and to say, in the transition, despite the loss of honor and the loss of honesty, we can work. And that's what pushes us along. Thank you.
Thank you.
10 minutes, Cesar. Thank you so much to both of you. We're going to open it up for about 10 minutes. Is that right, Cesar, for the next 10 minutes? Perhaps just a quick comment from my side. I was very struck by, the use of Xhosa. It really, for the people who speak Xhosa, there's so much power in the use of the language of Xhosa. When you say that, there it says, I put the white man back in his place. It's such a simple statement. But when you say in Xhosa, ndizamxelela undlebe ezikhanya ilanga eziqhitsini. There's something so powerful about the determination of, I'm going to face this person, I'm going to face to this, and I'm going to say what I have to say. There's such a power, and it makes me realize that we haven't engaged, well, as scholars, as emerging scholars, we haven't engaged with these kinds of issues that you're bringing us up to our awareness in a productive way. And I think we need to do this. We need these conversations. We want you back, both of you, so that we can think about these things. So thank you really so much. And now we are inviting you all, anyone with questions. We only have 10 minutes, so I think we'll take 2, perhaps, to begin with and see how it goes.
I'll just say one comment to what you did.
Yes.
The singer Asanda in the section is from the Eastern Cape, and she thinks of herself as an actor and not as a singer, and is very nervous of her singing. And I think her singing is so powerful that I'm going to pass your comment on to her, and she will be very encouraged by it.
Yeah.
She has a remarkable intensity and passion that comes through, which is very different to, you've tried speaking the lines, and then they get transformed when they have the emotional depth you get with the sung line.
You hear, it's carried in the body. There's a force that it comes with. It's not just the words.
That's the embodiment that you always see. That the performance is not just the movement in William's work, it's the way the lines are taken in and come out. It's the breathing, like his own obsessive walking in his studio. It's this rhythm that the body gives, the vividness that the body gives to the words.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, sorry. The vividness that the body gives to the language.
Cesar will be pleased. Yes, so please, we invite you, anyone.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe as all of us sitting here we had to try and make sense of all the imagery that you've shown and shared with us. From my perspective, what I saw there was a clash of language games, and by that I mean in the definition of Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with his thinking, but he uses the idea of different language games with different rules and internal logics. And for me, that is what I saw there. And my question to you is, from the fragments that we've seen that major montage, that's what we've seen, but what has been excluded? Is there still a lot of stuff lying around that we can kind of look and see that didn't make your montage?
You mean in the production? Oh, a huge amount. This is just the opening chorus and 1 minute in this there. There's some things that are verbal. There's some things that are not verbal. I think you're right, though, that the sense of play in the Gardnerian sense is important. The sense of finding what the grammar is of the different things we undertake. If you do a double exposure, you film someone twice and you put them over each other, so you have someone fighting with themselves, kind of a shadow boxing with themselves. What is the way you have to deal with it with the movement of the performer? Does he stay in one spot? Does he film him once in one spot and the other time he's circling around? How close does that have to be? When you're doing the actual editing, how do we have to light it so we can see? So the questions of meaning in the studio dissolve into a series of practical or grammatical learnings in the hope that when they come out of the other end, they're not just that, they also have a meaning. But they do dissolve into that question of how fast should these circles turn? Should we be shooting at a slow shutter speed so they're out of focus, or at a normal shutter speed so they stay in focus the whole time?
So can I just say, so from the Wittgensteinian point of view, the question of the language game is also the question of risk. And I think that's what you see here, in my view, not only in the sequence that you've seen, but in all these decisions, these technical material decisions that are being made. And of course, Wittgenstein doesn't have a sort of a theory of the kind of technology that we have, but he was, as you know, obsessed with film. And he sat alone night after night in Cambridge theatres in Cambridge, England, looking at films. So there is something here about technology, technique, risk, and the translation of these different forms and materials and media. Thank you.
Yes, Jackie.
Ask a question about what...
Oh, here, Jackie.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you a question about what travels and what stays behind, and the place of your espresso machine, which is in so much of your work, and it was really interesting to see it here again. It's like a memory. I mean, how do you think of these objects which, you know, repeat in your work and are part of our culture, you know, the raw material of coffee, the way of making the coffee? How does that link to this radical displacement that you're showing?
So in the production, the characters that we know, Fanon, Aimé Césaire, André Breton, the Nadal sisters, have these photographic representations, as you saw, or an image of their face, whether it's Lenin or Fanon there. But we also needed to represent, as it were, what they were against, the French colonial empire, the French bourgeoisie. And there's something about the shape of that Bialy coffee maker that is similar to the shape of the kepi hat of Pétain and the Pétainists. So on the ship, all of those people are represented by these coffee pots. It also means we can have fewer actors and more characters, because the women's chorus can put in a coffee pot and they become part of the same. So I know it's an Italian coffee pot, not a French coffee pot, so purists will say we should have had a French thing. There's something about the angularity that works well. It's both a kind of a military helmet in a strange way. but I wasn't specifically, I mean, the association that comes with coffee is of this huge trade in it from South America to Europe through Trieste to Vienna and to all of those routes. But until you mentioned that now, that's not a thought that had passed through my head at all once while making the coffee pots. But I'm sure in the unconscious, all of those things sit with an image of what coffee is.
Yeah, but you've also done a work called The Artist as the Coffee Pot.
Yeah. That's just because I've drawn so many of them. If you have to think that in the end you become what you draw, there's a kind of transmigration of atoms.
Can I just add to that something to do with the form and technique here? Mm-hmm. That when you make a collage or a montage from so many different temporal and historical moments, you don't carry necessarily the history with it as it was, but you do carry some resonance of where it was. The language of Fanon is not the same as the language of Aeschylus. They indicate not necessarily a historical connection or difference, but a temporal connection. Now, bringing these things in, gives them each time a new memory, as if the past was really, the memory of the past is in the present and could be in the future. So there is this way of what I have recently, participated and did a show. I think this work is it's not retrospective, whether it's about the First World War, it's retroactive. It takes those elements from a number of languages, from historical moments, and puts them to work now in a way that they were not working before. Or even if they did work before like that, they're now doing their work again. So I think that, in art, the retrospective is such a genre. I think these works will never have a retrospective moment. They will always have what is internal to their economy, a retroactive moment. This continuous activism of shifting meanings, translating, working with what is transitional. I think that's a great achievement.
You mean as if they're always staging a future moment?
Exactly. That they're always staging a future moment. That's why they're in this game. Not just because they're wonderful lines from the past. That they're always imminent, not immanent. They're not just underlying the history of art or film. They're always about to happen. And here our friend who brought up Wittgenstein, actually Wittgenstein has a wonderful line about this where he says, when you listen to music, you know the piece, you can hum the piece, but as soon as it starts playing, it's another experience altogether. However you know it, you're always poised in that moment, in that tangential moment, and then the music starts. Whether you can play it in your head or not, another headspace is created.
Wow. Okay, Thando, I have to say this about Thando. She's all the way from Grahamstown because she teaches both your works. And she can say just one sentence about that before you ask your question.
I'm literally about to teach Ubu to our first years, and it usually goes down really, really well. So I'm really, really excited to be here today. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation and this beautiful piece of art. I'm so struck by the mercurial quality of it, right? This idea of movement and fluidity, even though we're dealing, as you say, with fragments. I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the description that you've chosen to say that your work is surreal, and I wonder if that's something that you would use to describe this particular project. And the reason I would like to ask you that is because I wonder if the idea of surrealism isn't really a product of us trying to give an account of reality that relies on these rigid literal mindedness of the Enlightenment rationality, right? And I wonder if we shift ontologically onto the African or the post-colonial context, are we actually talking about an addition to reality, or are we talking about reality in the sense of it being layered, where that which would seem additional is also part of the real?
Thank you, Tandis.
I think, I mean, I understand the question, but it's not a question that we've, you know, when we're busy making something, it's not a question that we've asked, sorry. I mean, I'm interested in what surrealism offers as a way of strategies, of making things. I really haven't thought, is the work a surrealist work? I don't think, in some ways it is, in other ways, I don't rely on chance in the same way. There's often the construction of chance, but it's not as if we really pulled the lines which constitute, for example, the first chorus, were not in a surrealist way pulled out of a hat. It's not automatic writing, let the hand write and see what emerges. It's used as something that's neither program nor is it chance. It's something in between. So I mean, it's really nice in this project to play with chance, but once chance has had its say, we're quite careful about saying where it can and can't operate. The risk comes in, yes.
Right.
So I think, but the question of adding or not to reality, you know, those questions are in a way too hard for me. I really, it's so outside of the processes of making that it may be that at the end, but it's not that in the middle.
And so at this point, the really wonderful task of thanking everyone, we will pass on to my colleague, Anel Daris, Dr. Daris, who is a researcher in our center, who's in charge of the graduate program in our center. So, Anel Daris.
Thank you, Prof. Phumla. I think firstly, let's just give a very warm round of applause to to say that we are grateful would be an understatement. I think first and foremost to dear William, this is an extension of something that we did last year, to see that discussion and that dialogue, and this as an extension thereof has been incredibly profound. And then to Prof. Homi, I think to describe you is to say, your presentations and your engagement has been both enlightening, but apart from that, you've been so incredibly warm. I think all of us from AVReQ, especially who has been in such close contact with you since Tuesday, we have been struck by how gracious you've been towards us, making an effort to get to know everyone's names, even if we are in a formal presentation. As emerging and young academics, that is an incredible example for what the academy could be. You didn't look at us as emerging scholars or MA students. We were conversation partners in the room. And I think that for your level of engagement, to have the ability to translate that to us in effective and accessible ways, that will remain with us as emerging academics, as postgraduate students. That will remain with us, I think, for the rest of our lives. So to Prof. Phumla, thank you so much for giving us access to these people and these conversations. She doesn't like us thanking her. She doesn't like the spotlight to be on her, but I think it would be a miss if we don't acknowledge greatness in our own midst. So from AVReQ, in my capacity as the postgraduate programs convener, thank you so much for allowing us into the room for this conversation. I think the lack of questions was indicative of us being in awe. So thank you so much for that. From the greater Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, I think particularly for where Stellenbosch University is right now, these 3 days of engaging with the work of Fanon, I think Prof. Kupano Ratile asked the question, how do you teach Fanon in Stellenbosch? I think this is how you teach Fanon in Stellenbosch. So especially especially as our conversations are changing rapidly at Stellenbosch University, this was an incredible way to usher us into these conversations. From the side of the center, I'd like to extend our most sincere thanks to our hosting venues. Firstly, the psychology department, who gave us the venue on Tuesday, to our logistics team at AVReQ, that was run by Caesar and Kate, and also our graduate assistants who are here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Jolene as well. And then for today, for Stias, this is always such a breathtaking venue, so I think it serves as a pinnacle to these past 3 days. We always love coming to Stias. So thank you so much for hosting us today. And also, cherry on the cake today, Stias has incredible lunch. So please do join us for lunch if you are by means. To thank you everyone for your presence today. We also see a few faces who's been here the entire week. Thank you so much for always being interested in the work of the center. Our work would mean nothing if we don't have people participating and collaborating with us. And also just in the absence of the graduate school as well, thank you so much for collaborating with us in such meaningful ways. Thank you, everybody.